Ever wondered if you could survive a month without sleeping at night? But sleeping in the Middle Age was almost impossible. Hey, don't be scared. It's not going to happen to you now. By the way, welcome to the worst bedtime story you've never heard. Tonight, we're diving into the wonderful world of sleep, medieval style. Spoiler alert, it's less about drifting into a peaceful slumber and more about surviving the night without getting eaten, infected, or set on fire. Forget everything you know about cozy beds, soft pillows, and blackout curtains. In the Middle Ages, sleep was a full-contact sport, a nightly battle against everything from lice to the local priest's 3 a.m. bell ringing. Can you imagine that terrifying hell for a second? Imagine waking up in a half-rotted straw mattress next to 3 siblings, a goat, and a rooster with an attitude problem. The smell? Oh, it's a fine bouquet of sweat, mouldy wool, and last week's pottage. Curious to know how the people managed to sleep amidst such chaos? Grab a cup of lukewarm ale, because water will probably kill you, and let's journey together into the medieval night, where sleeping was almost impossible, but complaining about it. That's what we're here for. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where bedtime was a battlefield, and you, my friend, were the unwilling soldier. So, you've survived your day of dodging fleas, dodging chores, and, if you're lucky, dodging the local Lord's tax collector. Congratulations. Now it's time to tackle the most treacherous, underrated part of medieval life. Going to bed. That's right. Bedtime in the Middle Ages wasn't a gentle slide into dreams on a memory foam mattress with a white noise machine humming in the background. It was a nightly dance with discomfort, cold, and the occasional rat. Let's set the scene. It's the 14th century. You live in a one-room hut with walls so thin they might as well be made of damp cheesecloth. The floor, packed dirt, with a charming layer of chicken droppings for that authentic rustic aroma. The roof? A thatched bundle of straw, twigs, and hope, perfect for letting the rain in and giving the local rodents a 5-star resort. Now, your bed is a term used loosely. Imagine a sack of straw that's seen more seasons than your grandma's knees, stuffed with bugs, and maybe a few surprise leftovers from last night's dinner. If you're lucky, you get a second-hand wool blanket that's been in the family since the Black Death, complete with its own ecosystem of lice and questionable stains. Privacy? Oh, that's a luxury for the nobles. You're sharing this one-room wonderland with your entire family, and probably a goat or two. You've got your parents snoring in the corner, your siblings twitching in their sleep, and that one cousin who always manages to hog the blanket. And let's not forget the chicken that wanders inside at night, like it owns the place. Nighttime is when the real fun begins. You think bedtime's about rest? Think again. First, there's the cold. Winters in the Middle Ages don't mess around. Your breath fogs the air, your toes feel like icicles, and the only thing separating you from frostbite is that suspiciously crusty blanket. And if you're hoping for a fire to keep you warm, don't hold your breath. Wood is expensive, and the thatched roof above you is just one stray spark away from transforming your hut into a bonfire. And then there's the noise. The medieval night is anything but quiet. Outside, wolves howl at the moon, dogs bark at shadows, and the local drunk sings his way home from the tavern, completely unaware that you're trying to sleep in the world's worst group accommodation. Inside, there's the sound of your family's collective snores, a symphony of nasal whistling, and the occasional sleep-talking confession. Think you can just close your eyes and drift away? Not so fast. Medieval life is all about multitasking, even in your sleep. You're on constant alert for thieves, raiders, or that suspicious neighbour who might decide tonight's the night to settle that old feud over who really owns that goat. Sleep with one eye open, or at least one ear tuned to the sound of trouble. And don't forget the hygiene, or lack thereof. You haven't bathed in weeks, your tunic smells like something crawled in and died, and the lice in your hair are practically renting out sublets. If you're feeling fancy, you might give your feet a quick rinse in the nearest puddle before bed, but that's about as luxurious as it gets. Dreaming of a midnight snack? Good luck. If you wake up hungry, your options are stale bread or that one suspicious chunk of cheese that might be older than you are. Forget the fridge. Leftovers are either shared with the rats or left to ferment until they develop a personality of their own. And if, God forbid, you need to relieve yourself in the middle of the night, let's hope you remembered to bring the chamber pot inside. Otherwise, it's a dark, cold stumble out to the nearest bush, hoping you don't trip over a chicken or startle a skunk. Chamber pots are the medieval version of indoor plumbing, a luxury you'll share with every member of your household, smell included. So, there you have it. Bedtime, medieval style. It's a nightly challenge that makes your modern sleep problems, like a snoring partner or a squeaky mattress, look like a spa day in comparison. Every night, you go to sleep knowing you're one leaky roof or one plague outbreak away from the worst night's sleep of your life. But hey, at least you're not alone, because in the Middle Ages, misery doesn't love company, it requires it. And tomorrow night, you'll do it all again, grateful to wake up at all. Next up, your bed. Straw, bugs, and everything else, where we'll take a deep dive into the medieval mattress and its many creepy-crawly companions. First off, let's get one thing straight. Your bed is not the plush, pillow-topped paradise you see in furniture store ads. Nope. It's a sack, or if you're extra lucky, a wooden frame, stuffed with straw, hay, or whatever passed for insulation in the 14th century. And by insulation, I mean mouldy, half-rotted plant matter that smells like last month's goat stew. If you're feeling fancy, maybe you've got a mattress that's been in the family for generations, which means it's seen more butts, backs, and suspicious stains than the local tavern bench. And let's not even talk about how many fleas have made this mattress their home. Actually, let's, because those little guys are your new roommates. Every night, you tuck yourself in under a wool blanket that hasn't seen soap since the last plague. The blanket is scratchy enough to exfoliate a mule and heavy enough to pin you to the bed. Underneath, the straw pokes through like tiny medieval daggers, each one a reminder that comfort is for nobles and monks, not hard-working peasants like yourself. And then there's the bugs. Oh, the bugs. Fleas, lice, mites, and their extended families all call your mattress home. It's basically an all-you-can-eat buffet. Your blood is the main course. Every night is a symphony of scratching and swatting. You've got more bite marks than the village blacksmith's anvil, and your skin is a patchwork of welts and scabs. Bedbugs? They're not just a modern hotel horror story. They're medieval veterans of the sleeping wars, and they've got centuries of experience in making sure you never sleep soundly again. Imagine drifting off for a peaceful rest, only to wake up scratching like a dog with a flea circus in its fur. And let's not forget the rodents. Thatched roofs are basically open invitations for rats and mice, and they're not shy about joining you for the night. You'll be lying there, eyes half closed, when suddenly you feel a tiny paw on your forehead. Congratulations, you've made a new friend. One that might share its fleas with you if it's feeling generous. If you're sharing a bed, which you probably are, it's even worse. Brothers, sisters, cousins, the occasional neighbour who stayed too late at the tavern, all piled in like sardines, each with their own collection of smells, snores, and suspicious foot fungus. Privacy? Forget it. Personal space? That's just a modern fantasy. Now let's talk about the smell. Medieval beds are basically compost heaps in disguise. The straw collects sweat, drool, and whatever else you bring to bed with you. Over time, it ferments into a scent that can best be described as organic horror. You'd think the rats would stay away, but even they can't resist this pungent paradise. If you're a noble, your bed might be slightly better. Slightly. Maybe you've got a feather mattress, but guess what? It's stuffed with feathers from geese that probably died of the plague. And feathers come with their own delightful set of bugs and allergens. Plus the castle's drafty, so you're still freezing half the night. And don't even think about changing the sheets, because there aren't any. What you've got is what you get, until the mattress collapses or catches fire, which is more common than you'd think. given the whole candles and thatch roof combo. And when the mattress finally falls apart, you stuff it with fresh straw. Maybe. More likely you'll patch it up with whatever hay scraps you find, because straw costs money, and money is something you only see when the Lord's tax collector is demanding it. But hey, it's not all bad. Sometimes, when the moon's bright and the lice are tired, you might actually drift off for a few hours of sleep. And when that happens, it's a small miracle. Because in the Middle Ages, getting a good night's rest isn't a luxury, it's a survival skill. So tonight, as you settle into your straw, scratching your bites and listening to the symphony of snores and scurrying rodents, remember, you're living the dream, medieval style. So, you've nestled into your straw mattress, already making friends with the local lice population. You're ready to drift off to a medieval slumber, right? Not so fast, because now it's time to talk about the roof over your head. Literally. Welcome to the world of thatched roofs, the ultimate medieval DIY project, where rain, rats, and every creepy crawly with legs longer than yours come together for one unforgettable night's sleep. First off, let's clear something up. A thatched roof is not some quaint, rustic aesthetic piece to impress Instagram. It's a pile of dried straw, reeds and twigs, held together by the combined hope and desperation of generations of peasants who couldn't afford proper tiles. If you're lucky, it's sort of layered, angled, and mostly still attached to the beams. If you're unlucky, it's basically a sieve. Let's talk about leaks. Because when it rains, and it always rains, your thatched roof transforms into a medieval water feature. Imagine trying to sleep while icy drips tap dance onto your face at 2 a.m. Or maybe it's more of a steady stream, right onto your straw bed, transforming it into a swampy compost pile. And don't forget, that's the same straw you sleep on, bugs and all. Now it's a bug jacuzzi. If you're feeling brave, you might try patching the leaks. You'll grab whatever you can find. Mud, more straw, a prayer to St. Barbara, and hope it holds. Spoiler alert, it usually doesn't. The rain finds its way through every time, because in the Middle Ages, nature always wins. But rain is just the beginning. Let's talk about rats, nature's favourite house guests. Thatch is the perfect rat highway, a 5-star buffet of nesting material and warm nooks for breeding. They scurry along the beams at night, dropping the occasional surprise into your bed below. Nothing says sweet dreams like a rat's tail brushing your forehead in the dark. And it's not just rats. Mice love thatch too. So do weasels, stoats, and the occasional owl looking for a snack. It's a veritable medieval zoo up there. And guess what? You're on the ground floor. If you thought the fleas in your bed were bad, wait until the thatch rainstorm starts dropping little presents. Tiny droppings, bits of straw, or the occasional dead rodent. Because the only thing better than rats in your roof is dead rats in your roof. Oh, and then there are the insects. Beetles, mites, and more bugs than an entomologist's fever dream. They move in, breed, and occasionally fall out of the thatch like a confetti cannon of nightmares. Nothing like waking up with a beetle in your ear to remind you you're living in the Middle Ages. And let's not forget the fire hazard. Thatched roofs love a good spark, almost as much as they love fleas. One stray ember from the hearth, one candle too close to the wall, and your cosy straw hotel becomes a medieval bonfire. Imagine the joy of waking up to the smell of your own house burning. Again, if you're lucky, you can grab the family goat and maybe one shoe before the whole place goes up. It's no wonder that every medieval villager kept a wary eye on the roof. If it wasn't leaking, it was probably infested. If it wasn't infested, it was probably on fire. And if it wasn't on fire, well, give it a minute. The Middle Ages had a knack for turning even the most basic parts of life into a survival challenge. Some wealthier folks tried to avoid the thatch trap. They used wooden shingles, or, if they were rolling in tax money, tiles. Tiles? Like some sort of medieval celebrity. But even they weren't immune to rats, rain, and the occasional medieval pigeon with no sense of boundaries. So tonight, as you lie there, head on your straw pillow, scratching at the lice, listening to the rain trickle through the roof like a medieval horror movie soundtrack, remember that your thatched roof is more than just a covering. It's a reminder that in the Middle Ages, everything you own, including your roof, is out to get you. And tomorrow, same thing. Rain, rats, and a prayer that the roof doesn't collapse during your 2 a.m. bathroom run. Congratulations, you've survived the leaky, rat-infested wonderland that is your thatched roof. Drip, squeak, and all. But don't get too comfortable just yet. Because now it's time to discuss another medieval sleep challenge. Sharing a bed. And by sharing, I don't mean you and your sweetie in a cozy 2-person snuggle. No, we're talking about you, your siblings, your cousins, your parents, and maybe even a neighbour or two, piled together like human firewood on a mattress of straw and prayers. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where privacy didn't exist, personal space was a myth, and your idea of a bedtime boundary was hoping the person next to you didn't drool too much. Forget the concept of my bed or even my side. This is communal sleeping in its rawest form, a medieval slumber party where everyone's invited and no one brought deodorant. First off, let's talk logistics. Beds, as we discussed, are not exactly expansive. Picture a wooden frame, if you're lucky, with a straw mattress that's already half collapsed from decades of use. Now imagine cramming your entire family onto it. Mum on one side, dad on the other, siblings squeezed in like medieval sardines, and you somewhere in the middle trying not to get elbowed in the face. And that's on a good night. If a cousin or an extra farmhand is visiting, guess what? They're joining in too. Because space is a luxury no one can afford. Bedtime in the Middle Ages is basically a game of human Tetris. Everyone fits or no one sleeps. The smell? Oh, it's a potent blend of sweat, straw, damp wool, and that one uncle's questionable hygiene routine. Remember, baths are rare, soap is even rarer, and changing your clothes is something that happens when your tunic literally falls apart. So as you drift off to sleep, if you're lucky, you're breathing in a cocktail of medieval musk that would make a modern perfume chemist cry. Then there's the soundscape. Snoring? Absolutely. Siblings whispering secrets? Of course. Dad muttering about taxes in his sleep? Every night. And let's not forget the occasional fart, because no amount of piety can stop nature's call. Privacy? Not even a suggestion. Every movement, every snore, every midnight scratch is a public affair. Need to roll over? Good luck. That's a group decision. Try to move too much and you risk waking up your entire family, plus the goat who's decided to join the slumber party. And yes, animals are part of the deal too. Chickens, pigs, maybe a dog if you're fancy. Everyone's inside at night, sharing the warmth and adding their own unique aroma to the mix. And speaking of goats, if you thought they'd sleep quietly, think again. Medieval goats are like nocturnal stand-up comedians, bleating, snorting, and occasionally nibbling on your blanket. Nothing says sweet dreams, like a goat headbutting you at 3 a.m, because it's decided your hair tastes like hay. If you're wondering about romance, don't. Sharing a bed with your entire extended family is a guaranteed mood killer. Medieval marriage was many things, but private wasn't one of them. If your parents wanted a little alone time, they might hang a curtain or tell you to look the other way. But good luck pretending you can't hear what's going on. Let's just say the birds and the bees were less of a mystery and more of an awkward reality. This communal bed also means you're sharing your lice, fleas, and bedbugs with everyone else. If one person has them, and let's be honest, they do, then everyone's scratching. It's the Middle Ages version of a family bonding experience. Nothing says unity like a lice infestation that makes you all itch in harmony. But hey, there's a silver lining. Sort of. Communal sleeping meant shared body heat, which was a big deal when your only defense against the cold was a single threadbare blanket and a prayer to Saint whoever. If the roof was leaking, or the wind was howling, huddling together was the best way to avoid turning into a medieval popsicle. So as you snuggle up between your cousin's elbow and your little brother's feet, scratching at the latest flea bites and trying not to breathe too deeply, remember this. In the Middle Ages, bedtime wasn't about rest. It was about survival, community, and learning to ignore the smell of wet goat. Picture this. You're lying there on your lumpy straw mattress, half suffocated by your brother's snores, and suddenly the night air starts nipping at your nose. You'd think the walls would help keep the chill out, but those wattle and daub beauties are basically wind tunnels. Every gust of wind rattles the timbers and finds a new way to crawl up your tunic like an uninvited ice demon. So, what do? You pile on everything you own. Start with your linen shift, if you're lucky enough to have one that's not riddled with holes. Over that goes your woolen tunic, the one that's been patched so many times it looks like a patchwork quilt made by an extremely drunk tailor. Then come the capes, cloaks, and any leftover scraps of fabric you can scrounge. A cousin's old cloak? Sure. That suspiciously stained piece of canvas you used to cover the pig trough? If it's warm, it's in. And don't forget the sheepskins, nature's medieval heating pad. If your family has a sheep or two, and one's given up the woolly ghost, congratulations. You've just inherited the sheepskin. It's scratchy, smelly, and still has the occasional reminder that it was once a living, bleating creature, but it's warm. That's what counts. If you're feeling extra desperate, you might even sleep with a live sheep. That's right. Medieval children sometimes snuggled up with small animals, not because they were running a petting zoo, but because livestock gives off heat. And in a world where fireplaces are small, wood is scarce, and the wind howls like a vengeful spirit, you take your warmth where you can get it. Sure, the sheep might occasionally headbutt you in the face, but at least you're not freezing to death. And let's talk blankets. If you're lucky, you've got one that's more blanket than biohazard. Most of the time, though, it's a coarse wool monstrosity that's been around since your great-great-grandma first laid eyes on the local blacksmith. It smells like smoke, sweat, and regret. But it's heavy. So heavy it feels like someone parked a cow on top of you. That's by design. In the Middle Ages, blankets doubled as body armour against the cold, fleas, and the occasional mouse that thought your bed was its bed. Layering wasn't just a peasant thing either. Even in castles, the noble class had to fight the cold. Sure, they had thicker walls, and maybe even a fireplace, but let's not pretend they were living in 5-star luxury. Their tapestries were mostly for decoration and bragging rights, and the fires only heated one side of the room. The other side stayed as icy as a blacksmith's heart on tax day. So the lords and ladies did the same thing as everyone else. They piled on the layers. Linen shifts, wool gowns, fur-lined cloaks, anything to keep the cold from biting too deep. And let's not forget bed curtains. If you were rich enough to afford a bed with curtains, you'd draw them shut at night, not for privacy. Ha! But to trap in what little heat your body was producing. Still, despite all these efforts, the cold was relentless. Nights were long, and even the heaviest blanket couldn't keep out the chill that seeped through every crack in the wall. People woke up with frost on their noses, and dreams of the sun that might never rise. So tonight, as you huddle under every scrap of wool and linen you own, sharing your bed with fleas, lice, and maybe a suspiciously warm sheep, remember that in the Middle Ages, survival wasn't about comfort. It was about layers. Layers of fabric, layers of family, and layers of sheer stubbornness. So, you've managed to wrap yourself in every available cloak, blanket, and suspiciously warm sheep pelt in the house. You're basically a medieval burrito, hoping to ward off the night's chill. But hold that sigh of relief, because warmth isn't the only thing you're sharing under those layers. Welcome to the part of medieval sleep that truly tested your patience and your skin's pain tolerance. Bedbugs. Let's get one thing straight. Bedbugs were not an occasional annoyance in the Middle Ages. They were a nightly reality, a rite of passage, and a permanent part of your sleep hygiene, or lack thereof. If you were a medieval child hoping to drift off to sleep after a long day of chores, prayers, and goat chasing, forget it. Bedbugs had other plans. First off, let's talk about how these little bloodsuckers moved in. Remember that straw mattress you so lovingly arranged to keep the cold at bay? Yeah, that's also the five-star hotel of the bedbug world. Those straw-stuffed lumps of scratchy misery weren't just home to lice and fleas. They were prime real estate for bedbugs. Every crack, every seam, every hidden corner was a luxury suite for these tiny vampires. And once they moved in, they never left. Because in the Middle Ages, changing your mattress wasn't exactly a quarterly routine. Most people used the same straw tick year after year, sometimes decade after decade, topping it up with fresh straw when it got too flat, or when the smell of old sweat and goat pee became unbearable. Which means the bedbugs had generations to multiply, thrive, and perfect their biting technique. And bite they did. Bedbugs were like medieval ninjas, small, silent, and extremely efficient at turning your sleep into a horror show. You'd drift off, nestled between your sister's knees and your uncle's snoring, only to feel that all-too-familiar itch, a tiny pinprick that started at your ankles and before you knew it, had migrated up your legs, arms, and, heaven forbid, your neck. You'd scratch, and scratch, and scratch some more, until you felt like your skin was on fire. But that's the thing about bedbugs. They weren't just biting you once and leaving like a polite flea might. They feasted. Whole colonies of them, working in shifts, treating your body like the all-you-can-eat buffet at the local tavern. Of course, you tried to fight back. Some families tried sprinkling ashes around the bed or using dried herbs like tansy or wormwood, if they could afford it, to repel the bugs. Others resorted to shaking out the mattress or beating it with a stick until the bugs fled in search of calmer real estate. But here's the catch. Bedbugs are survivors. They'd disappear for a night or two, but they always came back. They'd hide in the walls, in the cracks of the wooden frame, in the hems of your tunic, anywhere they could lie low until the coast was clear. And let's not forget, medieval medicine wasn't exactly equipped to handle this kind of pestilence. Sure, you might get some well-meaning advice from your local wise woman. Rub your bed with garlic, or sleep with a sprig of rosemary under your pillow. But let's be honest, these are bedbugs, not vampires. Garlic didn't stand a chance. Even the wealthier classes weren't safe. Nobles might have had feather beds instead of straw, but guess what? Bedbugs loved feathers too. Those fancy canopied beds with their thick curtains, great at trapping heat, terrible at trapping bedbugs. So while the lord of the manor was dreaming of jousting tournaments and tax collections, the bedbugs were hosting a medieval rave under his pillow. And while we're at it, let's not forget the psychological impact of these tiny tormentors. Imagine being a medieval child, already sharing a bed with half your extended family, plus a goat or two. And on top of that, you're the nightly snack for an army of bugs. Sleep? More like a slow-motion, itch-inducing, sanity-shredding exercise in endurance. You'd lie there, staring at the thatched roof, listening to the rats scurry, wondering if the bedbugs had formed a new colony under your armpit. Sometimes it wasn't even about the bites. Bedbugs leave behind little, let's call them souvenirs, wherever they go. Tiny dark stains on the straw, suspicious black smears on your tunic, and an overall stench that made you question every life choice that led you to that bed. Medieval laundry day was already an exercise in futility, but bedbug droppings added a whole new level of despair. And just to add insult to injury, bedbugs didn't just come out at night. Oh no. If the day was warm enough or the bed was disturbed, they'd make a cameo during daylight hours, scuttling out from the straw like tiny demons summoned from the underworld. Nothing like a mid-afternoon itch to remind you that your bed wasn't a sanctuary. It was a medieval haunted house. Did people try to get rid of them? Sure, some folks tried boiling the bedding when they could spare the firewood. Others tried to burn aromatic herbs to smoke them out, and a few desperate souls just threw the mattress on the dung heap and started over. But none of it really worked, because in the Middle Ages, cleanliness wasn't just next to godliness, it was next to impossible. So tonight, as you curl up in your bed of straw and patchwork wool, scratching at that suspicious bite on your ankle and wondering if it's a flea, a louse or a bedbug, congratulations. You're experiencing medieval bedtime exactly as it was meant to be. A test of endurance, patience, and your ability to scratch without waking the entire family. Let's talk about night air, known in medieval times as miasma, a fancy word for the invisible killer you can't see, but will definitely get you if you dare to breathe. According to medieval wisdom, when the sun dipped below the horizon, the air turned from fresh and life-giving to a sinister, plague-bearing monster. Doctors, or more accurately, barbers who owned a rusty blade and an opinion, believed that night air was the main reason people got sick. Forget about open sewers, rotting garbage, or rats the size of small pigs. No, it was that cool evening breeze that was going to send you to an early grave. Because everyone knew that the damp, heavy air of the night carried with it all sorts of nasty things, fevers, chills, and mysterious humours that would throw your bodily balance into chaos faster than a priest at a heresy trial. Picture it. You're lying there in your straw mattress, scratching at your bedbug bites, when a draught creeps in through the cracks in the wall. Your mother gasps, your father curses, and someone's already muttering prayers to Saint Swithin to protect you from the invisible death that's wafting in from the outside. The only logical reaction? Shut that window tight and block every hole with straw, rags, or the occasional dead rat if necessary. Anything to keep that murderous breeze at bay. This fear of night air wasn't just for peasants. Nobles, priests, even half-educated physicians agreed that night air was the enemy. In castles, they'd drape heavy tapestries over every window and door. Forget ventilation. If there was a crack big enough for a mouse to squeeze through, it was big enough for disease to slip in and kill you in your sleep. So they sealed it up like a tomb. Fresh air was basically the Middle Ages version of a horror movie villain, always lurking, ready to strike when you least expected it. And let's not forget the children. Medieval parents were absolutely convinced that their offspring would drop dead from a single gulp of cool night air. So they bundled kids up like overcooked sausages, 3 tunics, 2 cloaks, and a woolen hat that smelled like last week's stew. The poor kid would be sweating like a blacksmith's apprentice, but at least the killer air couldn't reach him. Meanwhile, every open window was an invitation to disaster. If your hut even had a window, which was basically a fancy hole in the wall with a wooden shutter, you'd keep that thing bolted shut after sunset. Never mind the smell of last night's dinner fermenting in the corner, the goat snoring by the fire, and the half-dead rat you didn't have time to toss out before bed. Breathing that air was better than letting in the death draught. Of course, this obsession with blocking out night air had its own consequences. Picture a one-room hut stuffed with people, animals, and enough body heat to cook a medieval stew. Now imagine no fresh air to clear out the sweat, the farts, and the overwhelming scent of old socks. Congratulations, you've created the world's worst sauna, complete with fleas, lice, and the occasional mouse dropping. Now, if you dared to question this logic, say, because you noticed that the plague came with rats and filth, not just a cool breeze, you'd probably be accused of witchcraft, or, at the very least, get a stern lecture from the village wise woman. Because in the Middle Ages, challenging the status quo was about as safe as poking a wasp's nest with your face. It didn't help that doctors, those same barbers with the rusty knives, loved to reinforce the idea. They'd whip out their ancient scrolls and point to Aristotle or Galen, or some other long-dead authority who'd never met a bedbug in his life, but definitely knew that cold night air was the Grim Reaper's favourite perfume. "Close the shutters," they'd cry. "Sleep warm, and breathe only the air you brought in with you." And so, night after night, medieval folks sealed themselves in with their own personal stew of sweat, smoke, and livestock. They'd huddle under layers of wool and straw, breathing air so thick you could spread it on bread. And every time the wind rattled the roof, they'd whisper a quick prayer and clutch their blankets tighter, convinced that the breeze would be their undoing. If that wasn't enough, this paranoia also extended to the outdoors. Heaven forbid you had to go out at night, say, to the chamber pot or to check on the animals, because stepping outside after dark was like inviting the Grim Reaper to tea. People who ventured out after sunset were viewed with suspicion. What were they doing out there, tempting fate with the night air? Were they mad? Were they witches? Or, worse, were they just plain reckless? So the next time you're in your modern home, windows cracked open, fresh breeze rolling in, maybe even a ceiling fan gently humming, take a moment to appreciate that you're not huddled in the dark, clutching a lice-ridden blanket while everyone around you prays the wind won't kill you before sunrise. In the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just a nightly rest. It was a strategic battle against every imaginable threat, real or invented. And night air? That was the boogeyman that no one dared to challenge. You've spent the night clutching your blanket burrito, muttering prayers to Saint Close the Window, trying to keep that killer night air at bay. You've survived the onslaught of bedbugs, the lice disco party, and the rats scurrying in the thatch. Now let's talk about the one medieval invention that might, just might, bring you some relief from the cold. Say hello to your medieval fireplace, the closest thing you'll get to central heating. Picture this: a small hearth tucked into one corner of your one-room hut. If you're fancy, maybe it's made of stone and has an actual chimney, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. For most people, the chimney is a small hole in the roof that does a questionable job of letting the smoke out, usually just enough to make sure the entire family isn't dead by sunrise. Because in the Middle Ages, the phrase smoke inhalation was just another Tuesday. But hey, at least it's warm, right? The fire, when it's going, is the heart of the house, literally. It's where you cook your suspiciously lumpy porridge, dry your soaking wet tunics, and, if you're lucky, get a bit of warmth during the 300 days of medieval winter. But here's the catch. Fire is a double-edged sword. Sure, it might keep your toes from freezing off, but it's also the medieval equivalent of sleeping next to a live grenade. Let's start with the sparks. Fires in the Middle Ages didn't come with fancy grates or glass doors. Nope, it's an open flame. Sticks, logs, maybe a peat brick or two, crackling away, sending sparks into the darkness like tiny flaming arrows. And guess what? Your bed is made of straw, your clothes are made of wool, and your home is built of timber, daub, and dreams. Basically, you're living in the world's most flammable dollhouse. So every night, you faced a choice. Sleep near the fire for warmth and risk waking up to your bed on fire, or sleep farther away and let the cold night air sneak under your blankets like a vengeful ghost. A real-life medieval choose-your-own-adventure, except all the endings involve some degree of misery. If you chose to sleep near the hearth, like most desperate people did, you'd nestle as close as possible without actually combusting. Maybe you'd lay a few extra rags, or your one slightly less lice-infested cloak between you and the flames, just to be safe. But even then, one stray spark, one tiny ember, could leap from the fire and land right on your bed. And in a room where everything is dry as a medieval sermon, it takes about 3 seconds for your entire sleeping arrangement to become a blazing inferno. Medieval folks were aware of the risk, of course. That's why they'd often bank the fire at night, piling on ashes to smother the flames and hopefully keep a few embers smouldering for morning. In theory, this was a safe way to keep a small amount of heat going without risking the entire house. In reality, well, Let's just say that ashes can only do so much when your home is basically a haystack with a door. And let's not forget the smoke. Even if your fire didn't decide to murder you in your sleep, the constant haze of smoke in your hut was its own special kind of medieval spa treatment. Every inhalation came with a complimentary serving of soot, and your lungs slowly transformed into something that looked like a chimney sweep's retirement plan. People didn't just cough in the Middle Ages, they hacked up whole paragraphs. If you thought that was bad, imagine what it did to your eyes. They'd water constantly, turning red and puffy, making you look like you'd just lost a tavern brawl with an onion. And if you were already sick, which, let's face it, you probably were, the smoke made sure your cough evolved from annoying to legendary. Now let's talk about the practical joys of sleeping near the fire. Sure, it was warmer, sometimes even too warm. You'd roll over and suddenly feel like a roast chicken, your skin sizzling from the heat. Then you'd try to shift a little, only to realize you'd rolled too far, and now you're in the coldest part of the hut. Sleeping by the fire was like playing a game of thermal hopscotch, and no one ever won. And let's not forget the pets. Remember the goats, chickens, and occasional pig that shared your home? They loved the fire just as much as you did. Nothing like waking up to a goat chewing your hair because it decided the firelight made you look extra tasty. Or a pig snuffling around your straw pillow, looking for leftovers. If you were a child in the Middle Ages, this was your reality every night. Smoky, sweaty, and one spark away from a housewarming party no one wanted. You'd huddle with your siblings, cloaks pulled tight, eyes half closed, praying the embers didn't jump ship. And if you were lucky, really lucky, you'd make it to sunrise without having to run screaming from a burning hut. Meanwhile, the adults in the room would mutter about proper fire tending and good hearth management. But let's be real, no one really had this down to a science. Some nights, the fire burned too low and everyone froze. Other nights, it roared like a dragon on vacation and threatened to take the roof with it. It was all part of the medieval sleep experience. So you've made it through another night sleeping next to a spark-throwing fireplace, your bedbug companions feasting on your ankles, and the smoke-induced hacking cough that sounds like a dying donkey. But hold up, before you drift off into medieval dreamland, nature's about to call. And guess what? There's no indoor plumbing in the Middle Ages. Welcome to the next level of bedtime survival, the chamber pot. If you think modern bathroom breaks are an inconvenience, try it medieval style. You see, when the call of nature hit after dark, whether it was a tinkle or a, "Dear Lord, why did I eat that turnip?" situation, there were no bathrooms to tiptoe into, no porcelain throne with a fluffy toilet seat, no tile floor you could clean with a mop. Instead, you reached for that trusty chamber pot. Or, in the absence of such luxury, you might just shuffle to the corner of the room and hope no one noticed. Let's set the scene. You're lying in bed, or more accurately, you're wedged between your snoring brother and your aunt's crusty wool cloak, when that all-too-familiar pressure hits. Now, getting up in the middle of the night is already a feat. The floor is cold, the room is pitch dark, and there's a high chance you'll step on a goat or trip over the family's communal laundry pile. But holding it isn't an option, because the alternative is so much worse. Waking up the entire household with the medieval equivalent of an accident. Enter the chamber pot, humanity's first portable toilet and the unsung hero of medieval sleep hygiene. It's a simple contraption, a ceramic or wooden bowl, if you're fancy, maybe even a reused cooking pot if times were tough, strategically placed under the bed or in the corner. The problem? It was communal. That's right. One pot for everyone in the household, unless you were rich enough to own multiple pots. And even then, you'd be sharing with siblings, parents, and probably a wandering cousin or two. You'd shuffle over in the darkness, knees knocking, eyes half shut, praying you didn't accidentally put your foot into last night's leftovers. And let's talk about the smell. Imagine the combined scent of cabbage stew, sweat, and week-old cheese, now mixed with the fragrant offerings of everyone who'd used it before you. The chamber pot didn't just hold your dignity, It held the collective digestive history of the entire family. Oh, and emptying it. That was a special treat. The lucky soul chosen for this glamorous task, often the youngest child or the least favoured relative, got to carry the pot to the nearest ditch, stream, or sometimes just toss it into the street. Yes, the same street people walk through. Medieval sanitation at its finest. Just don't walk too close to the walls, okay? But let's get back to you. You've just made your midnight pilgrimage to the pot, desperately trying not to trip over a chicken or the neighbour's sheep. And now you're aiming, very carefully. Remember, there's no light except maybe the dying embers of the hearth, or a tallow candle that costs half your family's savings. Precision? Ha! Most nights you were just hoping for the best. And if you're a child in the Middle Ages, let's just say potty training was less about stickers and high fives, and more about learning to avoid disasters that could earn you a smack from the local wise woman, or a tisk-tisk from your mother. Miss the pot? You might be cleaning the rushes tomorrow with your bare hands. And forget about hand soap. Washing up meant a quick rinse in the communal basin, if that. Even in castles, where the noble class liked to pretend they were above chamber pots, the situation wasn't much better. Sure, they had fancy, close stools with padded seats and little curtains for a shred of privacy. But those were basically upholstered chamber pots. The contents still had to be dumped somewhere, usually by a servant who'd draw the short straw. And the smell? Still as pungent as ever, just with a hint of lavender if you were lucky. Now, let's talk about the great outdoors. Some brave souls preferred to do their business outside, but that meant facing the night air. Remember the last chapter? Which medieval people believed could kill you faster than a plague doctor with a rusty scalpel. Not to mention the potential for stepping on something unspeakable in the dark, or being greeted by a rat with the same idea. So, most people stuck with the chamber pot. Because in the Middle Ages, the comfort of a smelly pot under your bed beat the terror of the killer night breeze. It was all about survival, after all. And the chamber pot, foul as it was, at least kept you indoors, where the fire might still be glowing and the bedbugs were more predictable than a lurking highwayman. And let's not forget the social aspect. Privacy? Ha! Using the chamber pot in the middle of the night meant everyone heard you. Thin walls, straw floors, no curtains, every little sound carried. You'd finish your business, hoping the entire family didn't comment on your technique the next morning. Because medieval life wasn't just communal, it was embarrassingly communal. As you settle back into your straw bed, fire crackling dangerously close to your blanket, smoke swirling in the air thick enough to chew, remember the real terror wasn't just the cold, or the bedbugs, or even the killer night air. It was the midnight bathroom break. The chamber pot was a rite of passage, a test of courage and aim in the dark. Because in the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just a time to rest. It was a time to pray that you wouldn't accidentally step in your brother's contribution from the night before. So, you've navigated the treacherous path of medieval midnight bathroom breaks, complete with the chamber pot of horrors. You're half asleep in your straw bed, the fire's embers still glowing, and maybe, just maybe, you think you can finally catch a few hours of uninterrupted sleep. Think again, because in the Middle Ages, even sleep came with a catch: the night watch. Imagine this. You're drifting off, fully layered in your scratchy wool tunic, the chamber pot stinking up the corner, the smoke from the fire making your eyes water. But while you're busy scratching your bedbug bites, your brain starts to tingle with a different kind of worry. Because out there in the darkness, beyond the comfort of your one-room hut or drafty stone castle, danger lurks. And not just the killer night air, mind you. We're talking thieves, raiders, wolves, and whatever else the medieval imagination could conjure up to keep you awake at night. Night watches were as much a part of medieval life as fleas and holy relics. Whether you lived in a bustling town or a lonely farming village, someone had to keep an eye out, while everyone else snored. Because while you were busy dreaming of a breakfast that wasn't porridge, your neighbour might be eyeing your pig. And let's be real, pigs were worth more than your entire family's wardrobe. Let's start with the human threats. Medieval towns, even the small ones, were magnets for mischief. There were always a few folks willing to slip through the shadows, hoping to make off with a goose or a sack of grain. Or, if they were feeling particularly daring, the entire family's bedding. Locks weren't exactly Fort Knox back then. A determined thief armed with a stick and a little luck could get in and out before you even realised your prize chicken was gone. That's where the night watch came in. Usually, it was a rotating duty, with different villagers or townsfolk taking turns patrolling the streets or keeping an eye on the town gates. If you lived in a castle, it was a bit more organised, with guards posted at the doors and along the walls. But let's not romanticise it. These weren't elite soldiers with night vision goggles. They were usually half-asleep farmers, old men with bad knees, or unlucky apprentices stuck with the graveyard shift. Picture old Tom, the town cooper, stumbling around with a rusty spear, muttering about his bad hip while trying not to trip over the town's only dog. He's your protection from the dangers of the night. Feeling safe yet? And let's not forget the wildlife. Wolves were a real threat in medieval Europe. They roamed the forests, and sometimes even wandered into villages in search of an easy meal. Livestock, prime target. Small children, also a prime target. There were even tales of wolves working together, like some kind of medieval wolf mafia, to drag sheep, pigs, and the occasional drunk peasant straight into the woods. So when the sun went down, it wasn't just thieves that worried you. Every rustle in the bushes, every distant howl made your hair stand on end. Because while the chamber pot might be foul and the bedbugs might be relentless, nothing got the medieval adrenaline pumping quite like the sound of a wolf outside your hut, ready to test your door's structural integrity. Now, if you think you'd just lock the door and call it a night, think again. Most peasant homes didn't have doors worthy of the name. Maybe a wooden plank on leather hinges if you were lucky. Sometimes just a curtain. Good luck with that when a determined wolf or a desperate thief decided they wanted in. That's why villagers relied on the watch. But the watch wasn't some invincible force. They were poorly armed, poorly trained, and usually just as scared as everyone else. They'd carry lanterns that burned smoky tallow, which gave off about as much light as a glowworm on vacation, and they'd wander around, hoping their presence alone would scare off trouble. Sometimes they'd have a horn or a bell to sound the alarm. Picture this. You're finally drifting off, the chamber pot successfully navigated, when suddenly, clang, the night watch sounds the bell, because he thought he saw something move. Was it a wolf? A thief? A cat with a grudge? Who knows? But now the entire village is awake, stumbling around in the dark, half naked and half blind, with pitchforks and rusty knives at the ready. The best part? 9 times out of 10, it was nothing. Maybe a breeze rattling a shutter. Maybe the neighbour's pig having a vivid dream. But the watch had done its duty. Everyone was now thoroughly freaked out, and sleep was a distant memory. Of course, some nights the danger was real. Wolves did occasionally drag off livestock, or worse. Thieves could and did sneak in and steal anything not nailed down, and even some things that were. But more often than not, the watch was a mixture of superstition, communal responsibility, and the medieval version of a neighbourhood watch. Loud, nosy, and not particularly effective. So here's the deal. If you were a medieval child, your sleep wasn't just interrupted by the chamber pot or the cold. It was also punctuated by the distant clang of the night watch's bell, the growl of wolves in the distance, and the ever-present worry that someone, or something, was out there waiting for the perfect moment to ruin your night. And let's not forget the added terror of false alarms. Imagine getting dragged out of bed, eyes crusted with smoke and sweat, because old Tom thought he saw a shadow near the chicken coop. Now you're standing outside in the freezing night air, clutching a pitchfork you can barely lift, staring into the darkness. If you're lucky, it's just a gust of wind. If you're not, it's a real thief. Or worse, a hungry wolf. And suddenly your night's gone from bad to, dear God, I hope my boots are on the right feet. So, you've survived the chamber pot, the night watch's false alarms, and the lurking threat of wolves and thieves. You're curled up under your scratchy blanket, head pounding from the smoke haze, and you're just about to drift off. Finally, maybe, just maybe, you'll get a few hours of precious sleep before the sun starts its medieval version of a prison break through your thatched roof. But wait, did you think you were safe from interruptions? Did you think the night was your own? Welcome to the Middle Ages, where even God himself can't let you catch a break. Enter the church bells. Holy alarms you didn't ask for, and definitely didn't want. Picture this. It's the dead of night. The night watch has made their rounds, mostly stumbling and muttering about suspicious goats, and you've finally found that elusive sweet spot on your straw mattress, where your hip bone doesn't feel like it's poking straight through to the floor. The embers are glowing faintly, casting just enough light to remind you that smoke still rules the air. You're drifting off, head filled with dreams of breakfast, which, let's be honest, is just more pottage. And then, clang, the church bell, loud, sudden, piercing, like the worst alarm clock ever invented, except it doesn't come with a snooze button, and it's guaranteed to wake up every man, woman, child and chicken within earshot. Medieval alarm clocks, coming soon to a nightmare near you. Now, why the bell in the middle of the night, you ask? Let's unpack that. The church was the centre of medieval life, the hub of your spiritual existence, and also the town's 24/7 noise machine. Those bells didn't just ring for Sunday Mass. They rang for everything. Prayers, feast days, funerals, festivals, plagues, invasions, suspicious clouds, and probably just because the priest was bored. The most common midnight bell was for canonical hours, those holy moments in the night when monks, nuns and priests were expected to rise from their relatively lice-free beds and chant prayers. Think of it as God's official wake-up call, scheduled at times so ungodly that even the night watch looked at each other and said, "Seriously?" Picture the local priest, wrapped in a damp wool robe, hauling himself out of bed with all the enthusiasm of a peasant being dragged to confession. He stumbles through the darkened nave, muttering half-remembered Latin, then grabs the rope and gives it a good yank. Clang. The bell's deep iron voice booms through the darkness, vibrating every loose timber in the village, and probably scaring the life out of any night watchman who dared to nod off. If you were a monk or nun, this was your cue. Time to get up, trudge to the cold, candle-lit church, and chant psalms until your teeth ached. If you were a peasant, it was a different story. You'd jolt awake, heart pounding, convinced the Vikings were back or the plague had returned. Then you'd roll over, curse under your breath, and try to remember why the bells were ringing in the first place. But the bells didn't care if you were sleeping. They didn't care that your bed was full of bedbugs, or that the night air was trying to kill you. Their job was to call the faithful to prayer, or at least remind them that God was always watching, even at 3 a.m., especially at 3 a.m., because nothing says holy terror, like a bell in the dead of night, when you're already half convinced there's a wolf at the door. And let's not forget the emergencies. Fire, bell, raiders, bell, famine, bell. Some guy's cow wandered off. Bell. It didn't matter what the crisis was, the bells had to chime, because in the Middle Ages, the bells weren't just noise. They were a lifeline, a warning system, and a spiritual cattle prod, all rolled into one. The problem? Bells didn't come with labels. There was no handy sign telling you, "Relax, this is just matins," or "Grab a pitchfork, the wolves are here." No, every bell was an ambiguous, thunderous, holy mystery. So every time you heard that clang, you'd leap from your straw bed, hoping it was something minor and not the start of the apocalypse. And the sound itself? Let's just say medieval bells weren't exactly tuned like a modern orchestra. They were forged from whatever metal the local blacksmith could scrounge, producing a noise somewhere between a dying cow and a thunderstorm. So when it rang out at midnight, it wasn't a gentle reminder to pray. It was a medieval sonic assault. Add to that the echo through the stone walls, the rickety rooftops, the alleys and fields, each clang rolling like a thunderclap through every peasant hut and castle hall. Dogs barked, chickens squawked, children wailed. You could almost see the bedbugs pausing mid-bite to cover their tiny ears. And if you were lucky enough to fall back asleep, don't get too cozy, because guess what? There were more bells. Lords, prime, terce, sext, none. Each with its own time slot, and each determined to remind you that sleep was a luxury, and God's clock never stopped ticking. So tonight, as you lay back in your smoky hut, feet tangled in blankets, ears still ringing from the night watch's false alarm, remember this. The church bell is waiting to jolt you from your hard-won sleep with a sound that says, "Hey, remember that eternal soul thing? Time to get praying." In the Middle Ages, sleep wasn't just about surviving the cold, the bedbugs, or the fire hazard. It was about surviving the bells. Because even when the wolves were quiet and the thieves were scared off, the bells would keep on clanging, reminding you that peace and quiet were reserved for heaven. Maybe. Guess. You've survived the night watch clanging around like a one-man percussion band. You've been jolted awake by church bells that sound like they were forged by a blacksmith with a grudge against eardrums. You've tried to sleep through bedbugs, killer night air, and that one suspicious goat staring at you from the corner. But even if you managed to drift off between all that racket, the Middle Ages had one final ace up its sleeve to make sure sleep was never restful. Sickness. Because in medieval times, you didn't just worry about wolves and raiders and the local priest's suspicious cooking. You worried about fevers that could come out of nowhere, chills that made your teeth chatter, and enough night sweats to water a small garden. And if you got sick, guess what? Sleep didn't get easier. It got a whole lot worse. Let's set the scene. You're lying on your straw mattress, which is basically a mouldy sponge full of bugs, and suddenly you feel a tickle in your throat. You ignore it. But by nightfall, you're burning up like a pyre at a heretic's farewell party. The chill hits next, that bone-deep cold that makes your teeth sound like a medieval maraca. You pull your lice-infested blanket closer and try to ride it out. Welcome to the plague ward. Population, you. Now let's talk about the noise. Remember those church bells from last night? They're still going, but now every clang feels like a nail being driven into your skull. And the watchman outside has started coughing too. Great, maybe you've infected him too. Don't worry, he's probably sharing that cough with half the village by now. Your head pounds, your stomach churns, and sleep feels like a distant memory. Every time you close your eyes, you wake up either drenched in sweat or so cold you think your toes have turned to ice. Congratulations, you've got a medieval fever. And the best part? No one knows why. In the Middle Ages, medicine was a patchwork of superstition, guesswork, and occasional accidental wisdom. If you were lucky, your family might call for the local doctor, a term used loosely for anyone who could read a bit of Latin and owned a rusty knife. More likely it was the barber surgeon with his trusty collection of leeches. And yes, that's the same guy who gave your uncle a haircut last week, and probably still has bits of hair in his tools. His diagnosis? Probably an imbalance of humours. According to medieval wisdom, your body was a cauldron of 4 liquids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And any illness was caused by too much or too little of one of these delightful fluids. Have a fever? Clearly too much blood. Solution: let's drain some out with a dull blade. Sweet dreams. So while you're shivering and sweating, someone's at your bedside, with a bowl, a knife, and a look that says, "Trust me, I know what I'm doing." After a quick slice, you're lighter by a few ounces of blood. and probably a good chunk of your dignity. But hey, at least you're helping the local leech economy thrive. If bleeding didn't work, and it often didn't, there were other options. Cupping was popular. That's where they'd heat a glass or metal cup and stick it to your skin to draw out the bad humours. Or they'd whip up a poultice of herbs, dung, and whatever else they could find, slap it on your forehead, and hope for the best. Medieval medicine, as effective as it was aromatic. And let's not forget the prayers. The priest would stop by, sprinkle some holy water, mutter a few Latin phrases, and remind you that God works in mysterious and sometimes inconvenient ways. At least that part didn't involve a knife. But even with all that, leeches, prayers, and mystery potions, sleep was the last thing on your mind. Between the fever dreams, which usually involved more wolves, suspicious goats, and the local tax collector with horns, and the constant worry that your cough might turn into the plague, rest was impossible. Every time you drifted off, your body would jolt awake with chills or sweats, or a coughing fit that made the bedbugs scatter for cover. And let's be honest, your bed wasn't helping. The straw mattress soaked up every drop of sweat and fever like a sponge, turning your bed into a perfect breeding ground for every bug, fungus, and microscopic terror known to medieval man. Even the rats would think twice before sharing your pillow at this point. Meanwhile, your family, bless them, would gather around with worried eyes, crossing themselves and whispering about the possibility of last rites. Because in the Middle Ages, a fever wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a potential death sentence. Every sniffle carried the risk of the Black Death, or at least something that sounded suspiciously like it. So there you are, stuck in your sweat-soaked bed, staring at the smoke-stained rafters, praying that the bells won't ring again tonight. Because if they do, it might mean a funeral. Yours. If by some miracle you survived the night, and let's be clear, many didn't, your prize was a new day of chores, toil, and the relentless rhythm of medieval life. Because in the Middle Ages, sickness wasn't a time for bed rest and chicken soup. It was a test of endurance. So, you've survived the night of fevers, leeches, and medieval medicine that made even the rats think twice before sharing your straw mattress. You're exhausted, your head is spinning from equal parts holy water and blood loss, and just when you think you might finally get some rest, here come your neighbours. Because in the Middle Ages, privacy was about as common as a hot bath in January. And bedtime wasn't just a solo affair, it was a full-blown community event. Let's set the scene. You're in your one-room hut, which serves as your bedroom, kitchen, stable, and occasional chicken coop. The air is thick with the smell of old stew, sweat, and that particular brand of eau de livestock that no amount of medieval potpourri can cover. Your entire family is crammed into this space, and by family, I mean everyone. Parents, siblings, a couple of cousins who never left, and that one neighbour who always manages to find his way in whenever there's a free patch of straw. You'd think a night of sickness would buy you some personal space. Wrong. Medieval houses were built with community in mind. And by community, I mean everyone hearing everyone else's business, especially at night. The walls were so thin, if there even were walls, that a fart could travel from one end of the village to the other. So, as you lay there, your fever still simmering from last night's bout with medieval medicine, you're treated to a symphony of snoring, hacking coughs, and that one uncle who insists on muttering his prayers at full volume. Now, let's talk about the snoring. Medieval snoring wasn't the gentle buzz of modern-day sleep apnea machines. It was an unholy chorus of half-choked moans and rattles that made it sound like everyone was on the brink of death, or at least mid-exorcism. And since beds were shared, if you even had a bed, you'd often find yourself stuck between two living foghorns, each one trying to out-snore the other in a contest that no one wanted to win. But it wasn't just the snoring. Oh no. The Middle Ages had a gift for making sure sleep was anything but silent. Let's add some livestock into the mix. Remember, your house doubled as the barn. So the night was punctuated by the occasional goat bleating in its sleep, the pig grunting contentedly next to the hearth, and the family chicken, always the overachiever, deciding that 3 a.m. was the perfect time for a warm-up crow. And let's not forget the rats. Those little freeloaders scuttled through the rushes like they were hosting their own midnight feast. Then there was the gossip, because what's a medieval sleepover without a little eavesdropping? Walls were thin, and in some cases non-existent. Every cough, every mutter, every sigh was potential news. Did you hear old Tom's wife cough twice last night? She's probably on her deathbed, or maybe she's pregnant. Either way, the entire village would know before sunrise. And if someone had an argument with their spouse, let's just say the next day's small talk at the well would be anything but small. It wasn't all malicious, though. Sometimes neighbours provided comfort, if not exactly privacy. During a fever or plague scare, neighbours might come to check on you, often unannounced, of course, just to make sure you were still breathing. They'd bring you a crust of bread, or a questionable poultice, and then settle down on your floor to keep you company, which meant listening to every raspy breath you took, and commenting on how pale you looked. Medieval bedside manner at its finest, communal sleepovers were also a matter of survival. With wolves prowling outside and thieves lurking in every alley, and sometimes in the bed next to you, there was safety in numbers. Sharing a bed, or at least a patch of straw, meant you had a better chance of waking up in the morning with all your limbs still attached. And hey, if you couldn't sleep because of your neighbour's endless monologue about his bunion, at least you knew he wasn't outside plotting to steal your chicken. But let's not forget the children. Because kids weren't just quiet background noise in the Middle Ages, they were full-blown agents of chaos. They'd wriggle, kick, and talk in their sleep, and if you were unlucky enough to share a straw mat with one, you'd likely get a foot to the face at least once a night. And when they weren't sleeping, they were awake, asking questions like, "Why is Aunt Maud snoring like a dying cow?" Or, "Is that a wolf outside or just Dad's stomach again?" Either way, sleep was the last thing on anyone's mind. And if, by some miracle, you managed to doze off, that's when someone's bladder decided to join the party. Remember the chamber pot from a few chapters ago? That thing wasn't exactly known for its stealth. The clanging, the smell, the inevitable spill. One midnight bathroom break was enough to wake the whole hut. And then the gossip would start all over again. "Did you hear old Tom's wife got up 3 times last night? Something's wrong with her humours, I bet." Next up, midnight snacks, rats, rancid cheese, and the joys of medieval cuisine. Because after all that, you'll need something to distract you from the fact that sleep is a luxury for the rich, the dead, or the really lucky. Now that you've survived your communal sleepover, complete with snoring, suspicious goat sounds, and that one cousin who talks in his sleep about turnip theft, you've learned that privacy is a foreign concept in your medieval hut, and any hope of a good night's sleep is as realistic as a rat-free barn. But just when you think it can't get any worse, here come the bedfellows you didn't ask for. Lice, fleas, and the occasional plague. Let's dive right in, though, trust me, you'll wish you didn't. Lice weren't just an occasional annoyance in medieval times. They were a constant, unavoidable fact of life. If you had hair, and even if you didn't, they'd find a way to set up shop. Your hair, your eyebrows, your beard. Well, let's just say they weren't picky. They were your personal medieval roommates, and they didn't pay rent. Every night, you'd scratch yourself to the bone, trying to get rid of the itch that never went away. The more you scratched, the more the lice seemed to multiply, like a tiny army determined to make sure you never had a moment's peace. And because sharing was caring in the Middle Ages, your lice would inevitably become your neighbour's lice, and then your cousin's lice, and then the entire village's lice. Congratulations, you've started a medieval community project. Lice for everyone. But lice weren't your only nighttime companions. Fleas, those jumping little vampires, were everywhere. Your straw mattress was a 5-star flea hotel, complete with a buffet of warm, sweaty human. They didn't just bite you once and leave. Oh no. They bit you over and over, leaving itchy red welts that made you question every life choice that led you to this moment. And while you're scratching at those welts, your neighbour is scratching too, and the whole room sounds like a chorus of medieval maracas. And let's not forget about the rats. They'd crawl into your bed at night, lured by the warmth and the possibility of a snack, which, let's be honest, might have been your foot. Their fleas, yes, they had fleas too, were the real troublemakers. Because if lice were the medieval equivalent of a terrible roommate, rat fleas were the uninvited guests that brought the worst housewarming gift imaginable. The plague. Ah, the plague. The Black Death. The Grim Reaper's favourite party trick. Those rat fleas carried the bacterium Yersinia pestis, and one bite could turn a peaceful sleepover into a medieval horror show. You'd go to bed feeling fine, maybe a little itchy, and wake up with lumps the size of eggs in your armpits and groin. The fever would hit next, hotter than a blacksmith's forge, and then came the delirium. And let's not forget the coughing. Medieval medicine might call it a bad humour, but you'd call it a one-way ticket to the grave. Picture this. You're lying in bed, half asleep, scratching your lice bites, and slapping at fleas like a deranged drum solo. Suddenly you feel a pain in your armpit that makes you sit up straight. You peek under your tunic and, congratulations, you've got a bubo the size of a hen's egg. That's your sign that your time is almost up, and all the prayers in the world won't save you now. And guess what? Your neighbours will know. Because privacy was a luxury, remember? The moment someone spotted a bubo, or heard the wet, rattling cough that marked the plague, panic spread faster than fleas in a straw mattress. Neighbours would avoid you like the literal plague. Sometimes they'd board up your door to keep the infection from spreading, but let's be honest, the fleas didn't care about your wooden door. They were already on your neighbour's dog. In towns, the fear was worse. The church bells would ring, because why let you sleep when you could panic instead? And everyone would rush to the local priest or the nearest doctor with a rusty blade. Medicine? A mixture of superstition and bad guesswork. They'd bleed you, burn herbs in your room, or force you to drink concoctions that smelled like a goat's backside. None of it worked. If the plague wanted you, it got you. But even if you avoided the Black Death, miraculously, you still had to deal with lice and fleas on a daily basis. Medieval solutions? A good old-fashioned comb. If you were lucky enough to own one, you'd run it through your hair with all the delicacy of a blacksmith forging iron. And even then, you'd probably just dislodge a few lice so they could start a new colony on your neighbour's eyebrow. Some people sprinkled their bedding with ashes or herbs to drive away the pests, but guess what? Lice and fleas loved a challenge. The more you tried to get rid of them, the more they seemed to multiply. They were the original uninvited guests. Once in, they never left. And don't forget, communal living made everything worse. Every time you slept next to someone, you traded lice like medieval Pokemon cards. Hey, I'll trade you 3 of my lice for your best flea. Everyone was a carrier, and no one was immune. Let's start with the owls. In modern times, owls are the charming night sentinels of forests, wise, silent, even cute. Not in the Middle Ages. Back then, an owl's hoot was basically the Grim Reaper's ringtone. Superstition whispered that an owl calling at night foretold death, disease, or some other catastrophe you definitely didn't want on your already full plate of medieval misery. So when that eerie hoot sliced through the darkness, your pulse spiked. Not because you were worried about getting eaten, but because you were convinced the owl was calling your name straight into the afterlife. Sweet dreams. And let's talk about that hoot. Owls weren't shy about their nighttime solos. They'd perch on your thatched roof, their big glassy eyes reflecting the moonlight, and let out a call that made your hair stand on end. A drawn-out, tremulous sound that slithered down your spine like a cold eel. And since your house was basically a pile of sticks with a door, that owl might as well have been sitting in your bed. Good luck sleeping through that serenade. But owls were just the warm-up act. Enter the wolves, nature's night shift security alarm and constant reminder that civilization had its limits. In the Middle Ages, wolves were everywhere, and not just in children's fairy tales. They prowled the outskirts of villages, their eyes glinting in the moonlight, waiting for the perfect moment to snatch a sheep. Or, if you were especially unlucky, a sleepy peasant who forgot to latch the door. Their howls, let's just say a medieval wolf pack, didn't need microphones to make themselves heard. Their cries rose and fell like a ghostly choir, echoing through the trees and bouncing off the wattle and daub walls of your house. Each howl was a reminder that the woods weren't just scenery, they were full of teeth. And every peasant family had at least one story of a cousin or neighbour who wandered too far after dark and never came back. Sleep tight. Sometimes, when the wind was right, those howls would sound so close that even the rats would pause mid-nibble. You'd clutch your blanket, and maybe the nearest family member, and pray the night watch was awake and that the one rusty sword in the village wasn't being used as a doorstop. The wolves didn't care if you were sick, tired, or just trying to find a little peace in your plague-ridden existence. To them, you were just another slow-moving buffet. And just when you thought it couldn't get worse, cue the rooster. Roosters were supposed to be the noble heralds of dawn, right? Wrong. In medieval times, there was always that one rooster with a terrible sense of timing who decided to crow whenever the mood struck, usually at 2 a.m. His crow wasn't a polite, melodious announcement. It was a shrieking, off-key cacophony that split the night like a rusty dagger. There you'd be, finally drifting off after surviving lice, fleas, wolves, and a family argument about who stole whose turnip. Then, caw, that rooster lets loose, jolting you awake with the subtlety of a cannon blast. The worst part? He wouldn't stop. He'd crow again and again, each time more enthusiastic, like he'd discovered a brand new reason to ruin your night. Meanwhile, the rest of the village's roosters joined in, turning your pre-dawn hours into an impromptu poultry concert. Of course, the rooster's crow wasn't just annoying. To the medieval mind, it was a cosmic reminder that the night's terrors were giving way to the day's labours. That rooster was your medieval alarm clock. No snooze button, no volume control. Just a feathered maniac screaming at the top of his lungs, telling you it was time to get up and start the cycle of toil, suffering, and more lice all over again. And let's not forget the dogs. Oh, the dogs. Every village had a few half-wild creatures that doubled as watchmen and garbage disposals. They'd bark at the wind, at each other, at their own shadows. Every time a wolf howled, the dogs would answer back, creating a barking symphony that spread from one hut to another like a travelling minstrel with a broken lute. If you managed to fall asleep between the owl's hoot and the wolf's howl, the dog's barking would jolt you awake just in time for that rooster's encore performance. Meanwhile, inside the house, your family, still crammed together like medieval sardines, would be tossing, turning, and occasionally groaning about the noise. Uncle Harold would swear under his breath about the owl, the wolves, the rooster, the fleas, and his mother-in-law, and then fall back asleep mid-grumble. Your sister might mumble a prayer, half to keep the devils away, half to keep her own bladder from bursting. And the night watch outside? He'd be too busy trying to stay awake to worry about the noises you couldn't escape. Remember, sleep wasn't just a battle against your own fears. It was a constant siege of sounds. Every owl's hoot, every wolf's howl, every rooster's crow. A relentless reminder that in the Middle Ages, the night was alive, and it didn't care how tired you were. You've accepted that sleep in the Middle Ages was basically an endurance sport, performed on a straw mattress teeming with fleas and lice. But just when you thought the night couldn't get any more complicated, here's the final insult. Sleeping in shifts. Because the world didn't stop, even when you desperately wanted to. Picture it. Your one-room hut stuffed with relatives, neighbours, livestock, and suspicious lumps of who knows what. Everyone is on edge after hearing the wolves' howls and that one rooster's offbeat solo. But even after the night noises fade, which, let's be honest, they never truly do, someone's got to keep watch. The Middle Ages didn't come with a security system, unless you count the occasional dog with more fleas than sense, so the night watch was a literal part of your sleep schedule. And so begins the art of the medieval sleep shift. While you snuggled into your lice-ridden blanket, half your household stayed awake, taking turns keeping an eye out for thieves, fires, or the neighbour's wandering goat that could destroy your entire winter's food supply in one night. Then, a few hours later, the shift would switch. You'd be prodded awake, bleary-eyed, and still half dreaming of the last lice hunt, and expected to take your turn in the stay awake or else rotation. This wasn't a luxury for the fancy castle folk either. Even peasants who owned little more than a wooden bowl and a suspicious hunk of bread had to guard what little they had. Fires could leap from thatched roof to thatched roof like medieval gossip, and bandits or desperate neighbours were always on the prowl for an easy mark. Sleeping in shifts wasn't just paranoia, it was survival. Imagine the scene. It's the dead of night, the fire in the hearth has died down to an angry glow, and the cold creeps in like a medieval draft dodger. You're half awake, holding a makeshift club, or maybe just a big stick, listening for any sound that doesn't belong. Every creak of the house makes your heart pound. Is it a rat, a neighbour, or maybe a wolf that finally decided you looked like a tasty midnight snack? Meanwhile, your family snores like a chorus of dying goats. Every now and then, one of them coughs, mutters, or shifts, and your head snaps up like a guard dog with trust issues. You think about the stories old Tom told about raiders slipping in at night, and suddenly every shadow looks like an axe-wielding maniac. Welcome to medieval security duty, underpaid, undertrained, and under-rested. And let's not forget about the kids. They might have been too small to stand watch alone, but they definitely weren't sleeping peacefully. They'd whimper in their sleep, ask questions that made no sense. Is the moon made of cheese? And generally provide the kind of background noise that made focusing on possible threats almost impossible. But hey, at least they were awake to spread the lice around. The best part? Once your shift ended, it wasn't like you could just flop back into bed and snuggle up. No, because medieval beds weren't assigned seats. That warm spot you left had already been claimed by Uncle Harold's big toe, or Cousin Agnes's questionable dog, so you'd squeeze in wherever you could, if you could, and try to catch a few more hours before the rooster started its early morning encore. Sleep shifts weren't just about fending off dangers, they also reinforced that you never really got to relax. Even when it was your turn to sleep, you did it with one eye open, ears pricked for every sound, and a half-formed plan in your head for what to do if the night watch screamed bloody murder. Because in the Middle Ages, night didn't mean the world paused. It just meant different kinds of problems came crawling out of the dark. So, you've made it through the night watch rotation, half asleep, half terrified, and all too aware that every creak of the rafters might be a wolf, a neighbour with sticky fingers, or a rat determined to steal your last crumb of cheese. You've managed to squeeze back into a corner of the straw mattress, right between Uncle Harold's big toe and Cousin Agnes's questionable goat, and you finally drift off. But just when you think the worst is over, the real show begins. Medieval dreams and the night terrors that made sleep in the Middle Ages more unsettling than a pot of 3-day-old pottage. Let's talk about dreams first. In the medieval world, dreams weren't just random brain static or the result of too much rancid cheese at dinner, although, to be fair, that didn't help. Dreams were considered messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil, and sometimes from that weird piece of mouldy bread you ate because the alternative was starving. Every dream was a potential omen, and every peasant, noble, and leech enthusiast doctor had an opinion about what they meant. Picture it. You're finally drifting off after your night watch shift. The lice are biting in a comforting rhythm, and suddenly you're running through a field of talking pigs. In modern times, that's just a bad night at the pub. But in the Middle Ages, That's a sign that you might inherit a fortune, or die horribly by dawn. Interpretations depended on who you asked. The local priest might tell you it was a test of faith. The town wise woman might say it meant you'd catch the plague before sunrise. Either way, sleep was rarely restful. And then there were the nightmares. Modern horror movies wish they could be this terrifying. Medieval nightmares didn't involve clowns with chainsaws or mutant monsters. No, they were more visceral, more immediate, often involving demons, witches, and that one cousin who always gave you the creeps. Nightmares were believed to be caused by evil spirits, or even witches sitting on your chest, stealing your breath while you slept. It was like sleep paralysis, but with a medieval twist. They thought it was real. Imagine lying on your straw mattress, the fire dying to embers, and suddenly feeling an invisible weight pressing down on your chest. You can't move, can't scream, and in the flickering shadows, you're sure you see a dark figure in the corner. Welcome to the medieval incubus, the demonic sleepover guest no one wanted but everyone feared. The worst part? You couldn't exactly get up and Google how to get rid of a demon in my bed. Instead, you'd cross yourself, mutter a few Latin prayers you half remembered from church, and hope that St. Cuthbert's elbow bone relic you kept under your pillow was enough to chase it away. If that wasn't enough, medieval people believed that the devil himself could slip into your dreams to tempt you. And let's be honest, you didn't need much tempting after a lifetime of scratching at lice and eating bread that doubled as a doorstop. One whiff of temptation, and you were already halfway to a confessional. Some believed that even the act of dreaming about sin was the same as committing it. That meant that one spicy dream about the blacksmith's daughter could land you in the local priest's bad books, and possibly a round of public penance, or worse. Of course, the line between dreams and reality was blurrier than the bottom of a medieval ale mug. With all the sickness, stress, and random screams from the night watch, it's no wonder people's brains were on high alert. Hallucinations from fever were common too, so your nightly adventures might involve everything from dancing skeletons to talking goats, with a healthy dose of plague demons thrown in for good measure. And let's not forget that the night was filled with sounds that made your nightmares even more vivid. Every hoot of an owl, every howl of a wolf, every cough from your cousin Agnes in the dark corner of the hut felt like it belonged in your dream and in your waking fear. Sometimes you'd wake up screaming, convinced the devil was standing at the foot of your bed, only to find it was your neighbour's goat, sniffing for scraps. That's medieval reality for you. In the morning, of course, there was no escaping the judgment. Dreams were a topic of breakfast conversation, assuming you could stomach breakfast after another night of half-asleep terror. The priest would lecture you about impure thoughts. The local wise woman would offer you a charm made of herbs, chicken bones, and the occasional rabbit's foot, promising it would ward off demons, or at least make the lice smell better. And your parents? They'd just tell you to get back to work, because the fields weren't going to plough themselves, demons or no demons. So you've made it through a night of demonic bed guests, nightmares about plague, and that suspicious goat that somehow made it into every one of your dreams. You'd think after that, sleep would be a refuge, a chance to finally rest those lice-bitten bones. But not in the Middle Ages, because here comes the next sleepless delight: the weather. Forget your modern climate-controlled bedrooms and adjustable thermostats. Medieval sleeping arrangements had about as much insulation as a sieve. Your one-room hut was basically a glorified barn with a door, built by people who thought draft was just another word for free air conditioning. And that meant that no matter the season, sleep was a challenge. Let's start with winter, otherwise known as a months-long festival of frostbite. Imagine it's December, and the wind is howling through the gaps in your wattle and daub walls like a band of banshees. You're lying on your straw mattress, clutching a blanket that's more holes than fabric, hoping it'll protect you from the cold. Spoiler alert, it won't. The cold in a medieval hut didn't just chill your bones, it invaded your soul. You'd wake up with your nose frozen solid, your breath hanging in the air like a medieval ghost, and your toes threatening to drop off like overripe turnips. Layering helped, of course, but layering back then meant piling on every piece of clothing you owned, usually one tunic and a questionable wool cloak that smelled like wet sheep on a bad day. And if you were lucky enough to have a fire in the hearth, it probably smoked you out more than it heated you up. A small, smoky fire that couldn't keep up with the freezing wind was the medieval version of central heating. And don't forget about the thatched roof that liked to drop bits of ice-cold condensation on your head in the dead of night, just in case you were getting too comfortable. Now let's flip the calendar to summer, because if winter didn't kill you, summer would make you wish it had. Medieval huts turned into giant clay ovens the moment the sun hit their thatched roofs. And let's be honest, the sun didn't ask for permission to barge in. The air inside turned thick, heavy, and more humid than a blacksmith's armpit. Sleeping in the summer felt like trying to nap inside a bread oven while being slow roasted in your own sweat. You'd strip down to the bare minimum, assuming you had something to strip down to, and still find yourself sticking to the straw like medieval flypaper. Every movement felt like a battle against the gluey heat, and even the fleas and lice seemed to slow down, too tired to bite. But don't get too excited. They'd rally once you drifted off, ready to turn your sunburned hide into their midnight buffet. And then there was the smell. Because in the Middle Ages, deodorant was a concept roughly as advanced as the Mars rover. Everyone sweated through their one tunic and wool cloak, and washing them regularly wasn't exactly common practice. That meant that your summer sleep was accompanied by a pungent symphony of human aroma that made even the goats in the corner consider moving out. To make matters worse, your neighbours were sweating too. Remember from the last chapter how privacy was about as real as a clean chamber pot? Well, in summer, every member of the household, and probably the entire neighbourhood, added their unique brand of body odour to the nightly stew of stench. Aunt Maud's garlic breath, Cousin Agnes's suspicious cheese aroma, the dog's enthusiastic contribution of wet fur. It was enough to make you envy the fleas. At least they didn't have to smell themselves. And if that wasn't enough, let's add a few more players to the medieval summer sleep party. Flies. Clouds of them, buzzing in your ears and landing on every sweaty patch of skin they could find. Then there were the mosquitoes, armed with bitey little mouths and a sense of purpose that would put modern-day salespeople to shame. Every time you started to drift off, one would land on your nose, just to remind you that sleep in the Middle Ages was a group activity. Your blood, their feast. But at least in summer, you didn't have to worry about freezing to death. Instead, you worried about dehydration, sunburn, and that constant feeling that your skin might just peel off from the heat. And when the night came, that oven didn't cool down. Medieval huts held heat like a baker's kiln, making your bed the least comfortable place to sleep, unless of course you were a flea. And let's not forget the rain. Because while you might have prayed for a breeze, too much rain turned your straw mattress into a medieval sponge. Water would drip from the roof, run down the walls, and soak into the floor, creating a dampness that bred mildew faster than a gossip spread rumours. So instead of a cosy bed, you'd get a soggy, squishy disaster that smelled like mouldy turnips and disappointment. Through all this, you'd think someone might have invented a better house, or at least a halfway decent bed. But remember, medieval people were too busy trying not to die of the plague, getting enough to eat, and defending their turnips from that one neighbour with suspiciously sticky fingers. Comfort was not high on the priority list. Well, as you climb into your straw bed, still itchy from last night's lice, your skin raw from mosquito bites, and your clothes stiff with dried sweat, remember that in the Middle Ages, sleep was a test of endurance. Winter froze your toes, summer baked your brain, and every season brought its own delightful challenges. The weather didn't care if you were tired. It didn't care about your nightmares or your lice problem. It was just another obstacle between you and the sweet release of sleep. Just when you thought you might get a break from the sleepless chaos, the church bells toll, and it's time for another round of holy days and holy nights. Because in the Middle Ages, religion didn't just fill your Sundays. It filled your calendar, your dinner plate, and, unsurprisingly, your sleep schedule. Holy days were everywhere in medieval life. Every saint, every martyr, every holy relic had its day, and sometimes 2 or 3 if the local priest was feeling generous. On these days, the entire village might down tools, put away the plough, and shuffle off to the local church. Bells would ring at ungodly hours, just to remind you that even your bed wasn't safe from the sound of sanctity. Let's start with the feasts. These were the rare days when the pot of pottage might actually get some new ingredients. Maybe a bit of meat if the local lord was feeling generous, or if his cook dropped something on the floor and the peasants found it. Bread still featured heavily, of course, but on feast days it might even be white bread, which meant fewer sawdust fillers and more actual flour. The village would come alive with music, dancing, and the kind of cheer that made you forget about the lice, at least until bedtime. Feasts were supposed to be times of joy, but they were also a social minefield. If you didn't show up, people noticed. If you looked too happy about that suspiciously fatty piece of pork, people noticed. And heaven help you if you fell asleep during Mass, because that was definitely a sin, and one that everyone, including the local priest, would remind you of for the next month. Sleeping off a feast was an Olympic sport of its own, with your stomach groaning under the weight of questionable meat pies and suspicious ale. But feasts were just one side of the coin. Fasts were the other, and they came around more often than you'd like. The church calendar was packed with days when eating was, let's say, limited. No meat, no dairy, sometimes no fun at all. Lent? 40 days of fish stew and the same old bread you'd come to loathe. Advent? Another round of culinary purgatory. Every Wednesday and Friday? Fish again. And let's not forget the occasional black fast, where even fish was off the menu. Try sleeping on an empty stomach, while cousin Agnes is snoring like a blacksmith's bellows, and the fleas are plotting their next assault. Of course, holy days weren't just about what you ate. They were about what you heard and saw too. Picture a village at dusk, the sky lit up with torches, candles flickering in every window, and the smell of incense mixing with the smoke from 100 hearths. The local church might even stage a little fireworks display, medieval style. No fancy pyrotechnics here, just a bonfire that threatened to take the thatched roof with it, and maybe a few loud pops from damp logs that made everyone jump. If you were lucky, the only thing catching fire was the log. If you were unlucky, well, good luck finding a bucket. And let's talk about the music. Drums, flutes, and that one neighbour with the voice of a dying goat. Everyone joined in. Sometimes the noise was enough to drive the wolves away, or at least make them consider moving to a quieter neighbourhood. But sleep? Forget about it. Holy nights were wholly loud. Between the bells, the music, the prayers, and the occasional neighbour's drunken attempt at singing, your chances of getting a decent night's sleep were about as good as your chances of finding a plague-free straw mattress. But despite the chaos, and maybe because of it, these holy days were also some of the only times people felt truly alive. They were reminders that even in a world of hardship, there was still room for laughter, for music, for feasting, and yes, even for a little bit of fire. So while you might grumble about the sleepless nights, the overcooked fish, and the neighbour's off-key serenade, deep down, you'd know that these days were a reminder that life was more than toil and terror. So, you've made it through another holy day, feasting, fasting, and possibly trying to dodge the neighbour's pitchy psalms, while the bonfire threatened to turn your thatched roof into medieval toast. Maybe you even managed a few hours of sleep on your flea-ridden straw pile. But now, it's morning. Or rather, it's something that resembles morning, because in the Middle Ages, Morning didn't exactly come with a sunrise alarm clock and a gentle cup of tea. No, it arrived like a medieval wrecking ball. Bells, bladders, and one seriously over-enthusiastic rooster. Let's start with the bells. Because of course the church couldn't let you sleep in. God forbid. Literally. Before you could even rub the sleep from your crusty eyes, the local church bell would start clanging like an anxious blacksmith. It was loud enough to wake the entire village, livestock included, and probably the next village over too. That bell didn't care if you'd been up half the night on watch duty, or stuck in a fever dream about plague demons. The bell was your medieval alarm clock, and it had 0 snooze options. And let's talk about that sound. It wasn't a polite chime. No delicate ding-dong here. It was a full-on metallic assault that rattled your teeth and your soul. Every clang was a reminder that sleep in the Middle Ages wasn't a luxury. It was a brief pause in a life of toil, lice, and the occasional near-death experience. But before the bell even finished its second round of good morning, your bladder would decide it had waited long enough. Because let's face it, medieval life had exactly 0 convenient bathrooms. Chamber pots, if you were lucky. A bucket, if you were slightly less lucky. And if you were unlucky, well, let's just say you got really familiar with the bushes behind the house. Privacy was not a thing. Neither was sanitation. And let's not even talk about who might have borrowed the chamber pot during the night. So there you'd be, fumbling around in the semi-darkness, hoping you didn't trip over a snoring cousin or that one goat that always slept in the worst spot possible. You'd shuffle to your designated spot, probably next to the same suspicious stain that's been there since last harvest, and try to relieve yourself while praying no one decided to dump the entire chamber pot into the street at that exact moment. Because nothing says good morning like the medieval version of a flash flood. But just when you thought you could crawl back into your straw mattress and pretend it was still night, that rooster, yes, the one that started crowing at 2 a.m. for no reason, would let loose its morning song. If you were lucky, it only crowed once. If you were unlucky, it was the medieval version of a car alarm, going off repeatedly, at maximum volume, and right outside your window. Roosters didn't care about your sleep schedule or your plague-induced exhaustion. They crowed because they could, and because in medieval times, revenge was apparently a feathered affair. And let's be honest, that rooster's call wasn't a cute cock-a-doodle-doo. It was a soul-piercing shriek that sounded like a demon with a sinus infection. It was the final nail in your coffin of sleep, a reminder that the day was starting whether you were ready or not. Even the fleas would pause their breakfast nibble to listen. So there you were, half awake, half miserable, and 100% certain you'd rather deal with plague than that rooster again. The bells were still ringing, your bladder was still plotting, and the rooster was determined to give an encore. And in the Middle Ages, you couldn't just roll over and pretend it was Saturday. The sun was up, or at least the grey morning gloom, and the fields, the hearth, and the neighbour's suspiciously friendly goat were all waiting, because in the Middle Ages, waking up wasn't just about getting out of bed. It was a battle against noise, bodily functions, and farmyard alarm systems with no off switch. It was the start of another day, in a life that never really let you rest. So, you've survived the rooster's screech, the church bell's relentless clang, and the pre-dawn bladder fiasco that made you envy the goat's carefree lifestyle. Maybe you even managed to grab a chunk of that questionable medieval breakfast, your eyes still gritty with sleep. But here's the thing, sometimes medieval life didn't let you stay put. Maybe you had to travel for a fair, a festival, a funeral, or a good old-fashioned tax collection. And that meant leaving the lice-laden comfort of your own straw mattress behind, and venturing into the medieval world of travel beds, where bed is a generous term and comfort is a mythical creature. Let's start with the basics. Inns. The medieval inn was a magical place where the promise of a warm bed and a hot meal collided with the harsh reality of suspicious stew and beds shared with complete strangers. Picture it. You walk into the local inn, a thatched roof structure that looks like it's held together by wishful thinking and maybe a few prayers. The smell hits you first, a potent cocktail of old beer, damp straw, unwashed travellers, and the faint aroma of something burning in the hearth. You pay your coin, assuming you have one, only to discover that private room means a corner of the common hall with a ragged curtain, if you're lucky, and bed means a wooden frame stuffed with straw that's already seen half the village's rear ends. The straw is less of a mattress and more of a living ecosystem, home to every flea, louse, and unidentifiable bug in the Tri-County area. Congratulations, you've officially gone from home sweet home to survival of the itchiest. But hey, you're not alone. Medieval inns didn't do single occupancy. Unless you were royalty, and even then, good luck, you were sharing that straw with complete strangers. Travelling merchants with questionable hygiene, wandering minstrels who snored like dying donkeys, and maybe a couple of pilgrims muttering prayers in the corner. Privacy? Not in the Middle Ages. The idea of personal space was as foreign as a hot shower. You got the bed you were given, and if your neighbour's feet happened to be in your face, well, that was just part of the rustic charm. Of course, the night's entertainment didn't end with snoring. Inns were lively places, drinking, gambling, singing, and the occasional brawl over whose turn it was to eat the last piece of suspicious sausage. Every creak of the floorboards might herald a fight, a falling over drunk, or the landlord's wife chasing a stray dog out of the kitchen with a ladle. Sleep? Good luck with that. Every hour was punctuated by shouts, laughter, or the unmistakable sound of someone emptying their bladder in the corner, because the chamber pot was already full. Again. And let's not forget the occasional bonus guest. Rats. Medieval inns were like Disneyland for rodents. Plenty of food scraps, cosy straw, and travellers too tired or too drunk to care. The rats would scurry over your feet, investigate your belongings, and maybe even share the bed if they were feeling social. If you woke up with one snuggled against your cheek, that was just a medieval cuddle buddy, right? And what about the bed itself? Don't get too attached. The straw was never changed, just fluffed up from time to time, which is medieval code for redistributed the lice. If you were lucky, the straw might be dry. If you were unlucky, well, let's just say you'd be adding dampness to your list of medieval sleep companions. If you thought inns were bad, sleeping outdoors on the road was even worse. If you had to camp by the roadside, your bed was the ground, maybe softened by a cloak if you were fancy. The cold crept in like a hungry wolf, the dew soaked your clothes, and every nighttime sound felt like a potential thief or a bear looking for a snack. And if you were sleeping near a well-travelled road, let's just say that the occasional tipsy traveller might step right on you on his way to the nearest bush. Maybe you thought, if I were a noble, life would be better. A real bed, maybe even a pillow, and certainly no rats gnawing on my big toe. Well, buckle up, because even the castle's promise of comfort was about as real as a plague-free year. Welcome to Noble Nights, where the illusions of luxury came with a heavy dose of medieval reality. First, let's set the scene. Castles, those grand stone fortresses that loom over villages like giant reminders of who's in charge, looked impressive from the outside. Massive walls, tall towers, and that fancy drawbridge that creaked ominously in the wind. But inside, let's just say that draughty stone was not a friend to a good night's sleep. A medieval castle at night was basically a giant stone refrigerator, minus the convenient snack shelf. Let's talk beds. Yes, the lord or lady of the manor might have a bed with an actual wooden frame, a step up from the hay piles you'd find at the local inn. And sure, there might even be a feather mattress. But before you start daydreaming about downy comfort, remember that feather mattress often meant a lumpy sack stuffed with half-broken quills and whatever else the servants could find to bulk it out. And those pillows? Let's just say they'd been used so long they looked like the result of a long-term feud between a goose and a hedgehog. But that was the good news, because unless you were the lord of the castle, you probably didn't get that bed. Instead, you were parked somewhere on a floor covered with rushes, fancy medieval term for straw, that had been laid down to soak up the filth, or on a bench by the fireplace, assuming you weren't simply left to sprawl in the great hall with the rest of the castle staff. That's right, your bed was more likely to be a communal mattress of rags and hay than a four-poster fit for a king. And speaking of fireplaces, castles loved their grand hearths. Unfortunately, they weren't just cosy little spots to toast your toes. They were massive, smoky monstrosities that billowed soot like a medieval chimney factory. Sure, they provided some warmth, if you didn't mind coughing your lungs out and waking up every hour convinced the castle was on fire. Medieval ventilation was about as sophisticated as a sieve, which meant that instead of fresh air, you got a constant supply of wood smoke, animal odours, and the occasional whiff of something that smelled suspiciously like last week's feast. Of course, all of this was happening while your fellow nobles were snoring like champion hogs in the corner. Privacy was a foreign concept, even for the upper crust. If you were lucky, you might have a curtain or a wooden screen to block out the worst of the noise and the smell. But most nights, you were sharing that castle chamber with everyone from your brother-in-law to your second cousin's pet dog. Because let's face it, animals were often better at finding the warm spots than the humans were. Then there was the castle draft. Stone might have been great at keeping out marauders, but it was also great at inviting in every gust of wind that happened to blow by. Windows were covered in oiled cloth or thin horn, which meant that every winter breeze turned your bedchamber into the medieval version of an icebox. And those tapestries on the walls? Beautiful, yes, but mostly there to cover up the cracks that let in the cold, the damp, and the occasional curious rodent. Even the nobility's fancy sheets couldn't hide the truth. Castles were drafty, damp, and noisy. You might have had more servants than a peasant could count, but at the end of the day, you were still sleeping with a cold draft up your backside, and the constant suspicion that the dog curled up at your feet was actually a rat in disguise. Just as you toss and turn on that half-stuffed mattress, with the fireplace smoke stinging your eyes and your brother-in-law's snoring echoing off the stone walls, remember, in the Middle Ages, even the rich didn't have it easy. Comfort was a relative term, and sleep was always a test of endurance, no matter how many titles you had. So you've survived the smoky castle bedchambers, the damp rushes, and the dog-turned rat snuggling at your feet. Maybe you even managed to snag a few minutes of half-decent sleep between the brawling servants and the occasional wolf howling outside the stone walls. But here's the thing about medieval sleep. Sometimes it didn't end with a rooster crowing. Sometimes it ended with a priest at your bedside and the grim reaper rummaging through your chest like he'd lost his keys. Welcome to the final chapter, where sleep wasn't just rest, it was forever. In the Middle Ages, death was never far away. It lurked in the air, the water, the suspicious meat pie you had for supper, and that cough your cousin couldn't quite shake. People lived with a constant awareness that each sleep could be their last. And let's face it, with the state of medieval hygiene, the lack of decent medicine, and the world's worst ventilation system, it's a miracle anyone woke up at all. Imagine you're lying there, in your flea-ridden straw bed, or on that suspiciously warm bench in the great hall. The fire's burning low, the draught is rattling the windows, and you can't decide if the chill you feel is the wind or something a bit more permanent. You cough, just once. But in the Middle Ages, one cough could be the start of a plague or a lung infection. And before you know it, the village priest is shuffling in with a candle, muttering prayers in Latin, and giving you that look that says, you might want to start saying your goodbyes. Because in medieval Europe, there wasn't a lot of separation between sleep and death. The line was blurrier than a mud puddle in a rainstorm. People saw sleep as a rehearsal for the big sleep. Every night you'd close your eyes and hope you'd open them again. And if you didn't, well, That was considered both terrifying and a little bit expected. It didn't help that medieval medicine was about as reliable as a leaky roof. Got a fever? Time for some bloodletting. Broke a bone? Let's splint that with a stick and hope for the best. And if you had the misfortune of contracting something contagious, say, the plague, your chances of making it through the night were about as good as finding a clean spoon in the local tavern. The priest would sprinkle holy water on your forehead, the family would light candles, and you'd lie there trying not to think about that last suspicious cough. And then there were the dreams. Medieval people believed that dreams could be omens, and nothing got the medieval mind racing like a bad dream before bed. Dreamed about black dogs? Bad news. Dreamed about falling? Worse news. Dreamed about being eaten by rats? Well, that might actually be happening, given the state of your bed. Every dream was a potential prophecy, every nightmare a message from beyond. And if you died in your sleep, your family would pore over your last words, your last dreams, your last rattling breath, searching for meaning like medieval detectives. Let's not forget the rituals. If you looked like you might not make it to morning, the local priest would rush in to administer the last rites. Extreme unction, a fancy term for this might be it. The whole family would gather around, the dog would be shooed away, and the air would fill with prayers and candle smoke. You'd be anointed with oil, your sins forgiven, at least on paper, and everyone would hope you'd slip away peacefully. Or at least not too messily. Because remember, that straw mattress was communal property. Nobody wanted to deal with the cleanup. And when you did finally shuffle off this mortal straw pile, your family would carry your body, still warm, hopefully, to the local churchyard, where you'd join generations of ancestors under a wooden cross or a simple stone. A priest would say a few words, the villagers would mutter their condolences, and life would go on. Because in the Middle Ages, death wasn't an event. It was a constant presence, a quiet roommate who never quite left the house. So tonight, as you lay your lice-ridden head on that suspiciously crunchy pillow, remember that sleep was never just sleep. It was a fragile truce with the Reaper. Every dream could be your last. Every cough could be a final call, and every time you drifted off, you did so with the unshakable knowledge that someday, maybe tonight, you wouldn't be waking up at all. And there you have it, your whirlwind tour of medieval sleep, from straw beds to stone-cold castle draughts, from roosters that never shut up to rats that never left, and from suspicious sausages to dreams that might kill you. If you've stuck with us this long, congratulations. You're tougher than the average peasant, and your immune system probably deserves a medal. Because let's face it, sleeping in the Middle Ages wasn't just a nightly routine, it was a survival sport. Every night brought new hazards, fleas that feasted like royalty, chamber pots that doubled as the world's worst alarm clock, and the ever-looming spectre of death, watching from the shadows like the world's most dedicated night watchman. We've wandered through thatched roofs, castle chambers, and communal inns that smelled like the inside of a medieval boot. We've shared beds with strangers, rats, and enough insects to fill a medieval bestiary. And let's not forget the ultimate truth. Even the wealthiest lords and ladies couldn't buy a decent night's sleep. Because in the Middle Ages, comfort was a luxury, and survival was the only real goal. So tonight, as you snuggle into your clean sheets without lice, adjust your thermostat and sip that hot cocoa that doesn't come with a side of plague. Spare a moment to appreciate just how far we've come. And maybe, just maybe, thank your ancestors for surviving the medieval sleep marathon, so you could one day live in a world where sleep is a privilege, not a punishment. Until next time, sleep tight, and try not to dream of fleas.